or emerged over time, or exists as part of some wider framework? That's the question we're still circling. For something that hangs in the sky every night, the moon is a little strange. It's large compared to the planet it orbits. Its gravitational effect is strong enough to influence the oceans, and its role in Earth's stability is more than just a side effect. It might actually be one of the most important factors in why life has persisted here as long as it has. On the surface, the moon seems like a natural companion, a product of whatever forces shaped the solar system. But when scientists started looking more closely, they realized its presence is harder to explain than it first appears. The leading theory is that the moon was formed by a massive collision. A Mars-sized object, often referred to as Theia, is believed to have slammed into the early Earth. The impact would have thrown huge amounts of material into orbit, which then gathered into what became the moon. This theory explains why the moon's composition is so similar to Earth's outer layers, and why its orbit is relatively close and stable. It also fits the models of how early solar system bodies formed and interacted. But this explanation depends on a very specific set of circumstances. The size of Theia had to be large enough to knock material into orbit, but not so large as to destroy Earth entirely. The angle of the impact had to be just right, a glancing blow, not a direct hit. The materials had to coalesce instead of scattering, and afterward, the system had to settle into a stable orbit that would last for billions of years. That's a narrow window. A little more speed, a slightly different trajectory, and the Earth might have ended up without a moon at all, or with a chaotic ring of debris, or with an unstable secondary body that eventually crashed back down. But that's not what happened. What we got instead was a single, large moon, one that rotates in sync with its orbit, always showing the same face to Earth, and orbiting at just the right distance to have meaningful effects without destabilizing the system. Those effects turn out to matter a lot. For one, the moon plays a critical role in stabilizing Earth's axial tilt. Without it, the planet's tilt could vary wildly over time, moving between near zero and extreme angles. That kind of variation would cause massive swings in climate. The seasons could become unpredictable, or even disappear. Regions that are temperate now could become frozen or overheated, and then shift back again. That kind of environmental instability would make it much harder for ecosystems to adapt and survive long term. The moon's gravitational pull also drives tides. Tides move nutrients in coastal ecosystems, help regulate temperatures in shallow waters, and may have played a role in the origin of life by creating wet-dry cycles that promoted chemical reactions. The ebb and flow of the oceans aren't just background motion. They shape coastlines, influence weather patterns, and affect the behavior of countless species. There's also a subtle timing effect. The moon's influence on Earth's rotation is causing the planet to slow down very gradually. A few billion years ago, Earth's day was much shorter, around 6 hours. Over time, tidal friction has stretched that out to the 24 hours we know today. That process is still ongoing, though at a rate far too small to notice in a human lifetime. Still, the long-term result has been a slowing of the spin, which has probably contributed to the planet's climate stability. And then there's light, not in a mystical sense, but a biological one. Many organisms use the moon's cycle as a clock, coordinating migration, reproduction, feeding, or sleep patterns. Coral reefs spawn in sync with moonlight. Insects navigate by it. Even some predators and prey adjust their activity based on how bright the night is. The moon creates a rhythm that many forms of life have built into their biology. All of this from an object that, by some estimates, shouldn't even be there. Statistically, large moons like Earth's are rare among rocky planets. Mars has 2 small irregular moons, probably captured asteroids. Mercury and Venus have none. In our current understanding of planet formation, large moons are not a guaranteed outcome. They're unusual. And yet, Earth has one. And not just any moon. but one that seems almost custom fit for the job. That's what keeps bringing this question up. Not because anyone thinks the moon was placed there with tools or blueprints, but because the outcome, a stable, life-supporting planet with a stabilizing satellite, is unusual enough to notice. The formation of the moon, its orbit, its effects, all of it adds another layer to the question of how Earth ended up with such specific properties. Some argue that if the moon hadn't formed, life might still have emerged in some form. That's possible. But complex multicellular life might have had a harder time surviving in a more chaotic climate. And the long-term evolution of intelligent organisms might have been far less likely without stable conditions. It's one thing to adapt to seasonal changes. It's another to deal with a tilt that swings wildly over tens of thousands of years. If you look at the moon purely as a roundabout outcome, it's an impressive one. If you look at it as part of a larger structure, it's one more piece that fits surprisingly well. Either way, it's part of the system that makes Earth what it is. There are also more speculative ideas about the moon. Some suggest it may have helped protect Earth from asteroid impacts by altering the path of incoming objects. Others think its presence may have affected the distribution of heat within Earth's core, influencing the geodynamo that powers the magnetic field. These theories are harder to prove, but they point to a growing awareness that the moon is not just a passive companion. It's an active part of Earth's history. And even now it continues to move, slowly drifting away from Earth at about 4 centimeters per year. That change is tiny on a human scale, but over geological time it adds up. A few billion years from now, total solar eclipses, where the moon perfectly covers the sun, won't happen anymore. The moon will be too far away to appear the same size in the sky, which makes this current alignment, like so many things about Earth, part of a limited window, not permanent, just long enough to matter. Most of the time, gravity doesn't get much attention. It's always there, always working, but almost always ignored. You don't notice it until something falls, or until you stand on a scale, or when your coffee tips over and reminds you that even invisible forces still win every time. But in terms of building a planet and keeping everything on it in place, gravity is more than just background. It's the structure beneath the structure. Gravity isn't a strong force, not by the standards of physics. Compared to electromagnetism or the nuclear forces, it's weak. A small magnet can lift a paperclip against the entire gravitational pull of the Earth. But what gravity lacks in strength, it makes up for in reach. It never shuts off, it never gets blocked, and it acts on everything with mass. That quiet persistence is what makes it such an effective organizer. Without gravity, Earth wouldn't be round. It wouldn't even be a planet. The matter that formed the Earth would still be drifting in a loose cloud, never compacting into anything solid. Planets form because gravity pulls together dust and gas over time, packing it tighter and tighter until pressure and heat force the material into a dense spherical shape. That same force pulled in the core, the mantle, the crust, not as random layers, but in an order that reflects their densities. Heavy elements like iron and nickel sank to the center. Lighter materials floated upward. Gravity sorted the planet by weight, and that sorting still shapes how Earth functions. But gravity does more than shape Earth itself. It also keeps the moon in orbit, pulls on the oceans to create tides, and locks Earth into a steady path around the sun. Without it, the planet wouldn't just lose shape. It would lose everything holding it together. No orbit, no seasons, no protection from the harsh vacuum of space. The orbit in particular is worth pausing on. Earth's path around the sun isn't random. It follows a stable, nearly circular route. That kind of orbit doesn't happen automatically. It's the result of balanced forces, the forward momentum of Earth's motion, and the inward pull of the sun's gravity. Too fast, and the planet would fly off into space. Too slow, and it would spiral inward. But Earth's speed and position work together in a way that keeps it locked in a near-perfect loop. A kind of falling that never finishes. That stability makes long-term climate patterns possible. It also provides a predictable framework for seasons, day length, and energy from the sun. Life adapts to cycles, and those cycles depend on gravity doing exactly what it does. It's not just the sun that pulls on Earth. The moon's gravity creates bulges in the oceans, which we experience as tides. The solid part of the Earth even shifts slightly in response, an effect called Earth tides. These tiny movements contribute to stress within the crust, which over long periods influences tectonic activity. In other words, gravity isn't just holding things together, it's shaping how they move and evolve. Even the tilt of Earth's axis, the angle that gives us seasons, is held steady in part by gravitational interactions. Without that stabilization, the planet might tip more over time or spin chaotically. Instead, gravity from the sun and moon keeps the tilt within a narrow range. That's another way in which gravity supports a predictable environment. Not by fixing everything in place, but by creating limits within which variation can occur. At a smaller scale, gravity affects everything from mountain ranges to river flow. It pulls glaciers down slopes, guides rainfall into watersheds, and shapes erosion over time. The landscapes we see, valleys, cliffs, plains, are the result of materials slowly moving under the influence of gravity. Even the way trees grow is shaped by gravity. Roots grow downward, stems push upward, guided by tiny cellular mechanisms that sense gravitational pull. All of these effects are easy to overlook because they happen slowly. Gravity doesn't make a sound, it doesn't flicker or glow, but its influence is continuous, and it connects every part of Earth's systems, from the rotation of the core to the position of clouds in the sky. Then there's the human side of things. Our own biology is tuned to Earth's gravity. The strength of our bones, the way blood circulates, even how we balance when we stand. All of it depends on a specific gravitational pull. In low gravity, muscles weaken, fluids shift, eyesight can change. That's why astronauts experience a range of effects in space. Their bodies are adapted to a specific force, 9.8 meters per second squared. And without it, everything has to adjust. If Earth had slightly more mass, gravity would be stronger. Bodies might need to be shorter or more robust. If gravity were weaker, the atmosphere might be thinner. It might even drift away over time. So the planet's size and mass aren't just abstract numbers. They're part of the conditions that make surface life possible. The atmosphere stays in place. Water flows the way it does. Humans and animals grow to certain sizes. Even birds and insects fly with wings that evolved under these exact conditions. And beyond Earth, gravity still acts as the main architect. It holds together galaxies, shapes the motion of stars, and bends light from distant objects. Something we've measured and used to detect things we can't even see directly. That bending of light, called gravitational lensing, is one of the ways we know dark matter exists. We can't see it, but we see its effects, just like we don't see gravity, but we feel its presence in everything that holds still or moves with direction. In a universe where so much seems chaotic or random, gravity is one of the few things that brings order, not in a perfect mechanical way, but in a quiet, persistent one. It doesn't explain everything, but it provides the conditions under which other things can happen. And without it, none of this would be here. Of all the substances that exist in the universe, water might seem like one of the simplest. 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom, that's all it takes. And yet, it behaves in ways that make it far more than just a chemical compound. On Earth, water is everywhere. It fills oceans, shapes weather, carves landscapes, and flows through every living cell. It's essential to life as we know it. But when you start looking at how it behaves, and how rare that behavior is, it becomes harder to think of water as just a lucky coincidence. Water has a number of properties that make it unusual. One of the most important is its ability to exist in all 3 states: solid, liquid, and gas. within the range of temperatures found naturally on Earth. That's not common. Most substances tend to favor one state or require extreme conditions to change. But water can freeze, melt, and evaporate within a narrow range that aligns neatly with the planet's climate. That alone might not seem remarkable until you consider what those phase changes actually do. When water evaporates, it absorbs heat, helping to cool surfaces. When it condenses into clouds, it releases that heat, warming the atmosphere. This process plays a major role in distributing energy around the globe. It drives weather systems, helps regulate temperature, and keeps the climate from drifting too far in any one direction. Another key property is water's high specific heat. That means it can absorb a lot of energy before its temperature starts to change. This makes oceans and lakes into thermal buffers. They absorb heat in the summer and release it in the winter, smoothing out temperature swings that would otherwise be much more extreme. Without that buffering, the difference between night and day, or summer and winter, would be far more severe. But perhaps the most famous quirk of water is that it expands when it freezes. Most substances become denser as they get colder. Water does too, up until about 4 degrees Celsius. Then, as it approaches freezing, it begins to expand. The result is that ice floats. That single trait has enormous consequences. It means lakes and oceans freeze from the top down, creating an insulating layer that protects the water beneath. Life continues under the ice. Ecosystems survive the winter. And when the ice melts, it doesn't sink and disrupt everything below. Then there's the way water behaves as a solvent. It's sometimes called the universal solvent because it can dissolve more substances than any other liquid. That allows it to carry minerals, nutrients, and gases through soil, rivers, and living systems. Inside the body, water moves substances in and out of cells, transports hormones, regulates temperature, and helps maintain structure. Its polarity, the fact that it has a slightly positive side and slightly negative side, allows it to form hydrogen bonds, which in turn affect how proteins fold, how DNA holds its shape, and how enzymes function. These traits aren't random. They come from the angle of the H2O molecule, the way electrons are distributed, and the nature of the bonds involved. Change those details even slightly, and water behaves differently, maybe less flexible, maybe less supportive of life. But here on Earth, water does exactly what it needs to do. What makes this more interesting is that water is actually pretty common in the universe. Hydrogen and oxygen are both abundant elements, and we found evidence of water in many places, in the form of ice on moons and asteroids, as vapor in comets, and possibly as liquid under the surfaces of certain planets or moons. But what Earth seems to have, and what's much rarer, is water in large, stable, surface-level quantities. Oceans cover about 70% of Earth's surface. That's a huge amount, and they've been there for billions of years. No other planet in the solar system has anything comparable. Mars has ice and may have had liquid water in the past, but it's long gone from the surface. Venus may have once had oceans too, but its atmosphere changed and boiled them away. The fact that Earth's water stayed, that it didn't freeze entirely or evaporate, means the planet stayed within a narrow temperature window for a very long time. How Earth got all that water is still a subject of debate. One theory is that water was locked in the minerals that formed the planet and slowly released over time. Another is that it arrived later, delivered by icy comets or asteroids. It might be a mix of both, but either way, the amount and distribution of water ended up being just enough to create oceans, sustain weather, and support a hydrological cycle. Evaporation, condensation, precipitation, runoff, that moves constantly between land, sky, and sea. That cycle supports ecosystems of all kinds. It nourishes forests, fills rivers, shapes coastlines, and wears down mountains. It erodes rock into soil and carries nutrients from one place to another. Without it, Earth wouldn't be the green, shifting, living planet we know. The land would dry out, plants would fail, food chains would collapse. Water isn't just an ingredient of life, it's the system that life moves through. Even its interaction with the light plays a role. Water is transparent in the visible range, allowing sunlight to penetrate oceans and fuel photosynthesis in aquatic plants. If it were opaque, underwater ecosystems would have to survive in darkness. But they don't, because water lets in light, but not too much. It filters harmful ultraviolet rays while still allowing enough energy for life to thrive. Rain, snow, clouds, fog, all of these are parts of water's constant movement. They affect temperature, visibility, behavior, even mood. They change how animals migrate, how people plant crops, how landscapes evolve. And the timing of those patterns, how often it rains, how long snow lasts when dry seasons begin, is linked to everything from geography to air currents to planetary tilt. Earth's climate and its water systems are locked into a feedback loop that, for now, continues to support a wide range of life forms. Even in the deep ocean, far from sunlight, life persists. Hydrothermal vents release heat and minerals, and entire ecosystems cluster around them. Bacteria convert chemical energy into food, supporting fish, crustaceans, and strange organisms found nowhere else. These underwater environments are reminders that life doesn't always need light, but it still needs water. There's something striking about the fact that Earth's most common liquid is also its most vital. That a substance so simple in structure turns out to be complex in function, and that the conditions needed to keep it flowing, atmospheric pressure, surface temperature, planetary mass, are all tightly interwoven. This doesn't mean water was designed to behave this way. It may simply be that life adapted to what water already does. But even that explanation leaves open the question, why does water do all this in the first place? Why does a molecule with 3 atoms become the basis for a system that supports such a vast and varied web of living things? In a different universe, with different physics, water might not exist, or it might behave differently, or it might be irrelevant, replaced by some other medium. But in this universe, with these rules, and on this planet, water fits the role almost perfectly. It flows, carries, dissolves, freezes, and transforms, quietly running the background processes that life depends on every moment. When you start looking closely at the shapes that life takes, the way trees branch, shells curl, petals align, or crystals form, you start to see patterns, not just resemblance, but repetition. Certain structures show up again and again across different scales and environments. Some are symmetrical, some are spiral, some fit ratios that can be described with simple numbers. And while all of these forms can be explained by physical processes, the consistency is hard to ignore. Symmetry is probably the easiest one to spot. It shows up in faces, bodies, leaves, insects, snowflakes. When both sides of something mirror each other, whether vertically, horizontally, or rotationally, we call it symmetrical. That kind of balance can be structural, helping an organism move more efficiently or distribute weight evenly. But symmetry also seems to appeal to perception. Human brains are wired to recognize it quickly. We tend to find symmetrical faces more attractive. We use symmetry in design, architecture, and symbols. It registers as orderly, familiar, complete. In nature, symmetry often serves a purpose. A butterfly's wings match because they form together. A starfish has radial symmetry that helps it move and respond to its environment. Leaves grow in the matched pairs to capture light evenly. Even many viruses are built with symmetrical protein shells, not because they need to be beautiful, but because symmetry is efficient. It allows for repeated use of the same genetic instructions. From a material standpoint, it's a shortcut. Make one piece, then copy it over and over. But not everything is mirrored. Some of the most interesting structures in nature are spiral. You see spirals in snail shells, hurricanes, whirlpools, and galaxies. You see them in pine cones and sunflower heads, in fingerprints and animal horns. Spirals often appear where growth is involved. They allow structures to expand outward while staying compact. As the organism adds material, a new scale, a new layer, a new petal, the spiral makes room without disrupting the whole. Many of these spirals follow a mathematical pattern called the Fibonacci sequence. It's a series of numbers where each new number is the sum of the two before it. 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. This sequence shows up in how petals are arranged, how tree branches split, how seeds are packed. The ratio between Fibonacci numbers approaches what's known as the golden ratio, a proportion that seems to recur in both nature and art. It's not universal, but it's common enough that it invites attention. These patterns don't require any intelligence to appear. They can emerge naturally through processes of growth and competition. For example, if a plant is growing new leaves and trying to minimize how much each one blocks the sunlight for the others, it may evolve a spiral arrangement. That arrangement, in turn, aligns with the golden angle, a fraction of a full rotation that distributes elements efficiently. No one designed it to be beautiful. It just works, and yet it ends up being beautiful anyway. That's where the idea of sacred geometry often comes in. It's a term that's been used in different ways, sometimes spiritual, sometimes symbolic, sometimes just poetic, to describe patterns that seem to carry meaning because of their structure. Circles, triangles, spirals, hexagons. These shapes show up in religious art, in ancient architecture, in mandalas and monuments. But they also show up in snowflakes, honeycombs, and coral reefs. The overlap between natural geometry and human expression isn't accidental. It's possible that we copy what we see. We repeat these shapes in our buildings and symbols because they're already familiar from the natural world. Or maybe we're wired to notice them, to feel that certain forms are more complete, more meaningful, more pleasing. Because they follow simple rules we can sense, even if we don't consciously understand them. Hexagons are a good example. Bees build their hives with them because it's the most efficient way to divide a surface into equal areas with minimal material. It creates a strong, stable structure using the least amount of wax. But you also see hexagons in basalt rock formations, like the Giant's Causeway, or in bubbles that settle into foam. The same shape emerges from pressure and physics, even when no bees are involved. Crystals are another case. Their atoms arrange themselves into repeating patterns that can form cubes, prisms, or even complex branching forms. These shapes aren't carved or placed as they grow that way. The structure comes from the internal rules of how the molecules interact. Temperature, pressure, and chemical bonds guide the growth, and the result is something that looks both random and deliberate at the same time. You also see fractals, patterns that repeat at different scales. Tree branches split into smaller branches, rivers divide into tributaries, lightning forks, veins spread, lungs divide. Each level looks like a smaller version of the whole. Fractals are efficient ways to distribute energy or resources. They allow a system to reach many points from a central core, and they often emerge from simple rules applied repeatedly. That's what makes so many of these patterns compelling. They don't require complexity to appear. They arise from feedback loops, constraints, and repeated processes. They're built into how materials behave under certain conditions. But even if they're not the result of intention, they look intentional. They create a kind of visual logic, something that seems too consistent to be meaningless. There's also a sense of harmony in how these patterns fit together. The way branches fill space without overlapping, the way spirals pack seeds with no gaps, the way snowflakes grow along symmetrical paths. These aren't chaotic outcomes, they're structured. And when you stack up enough structured outcomes, you start to wonder whether structure itself might be part of the deeper picture. Some scientists have suggested that certain forms, like spheres, spirals, or hexagons, are preferred solutions in physical systems. That is, given enough time and freedom, matter will tend toward these shapes because they're stable or efficient. That's a useful explanation, but it still invites the question, why are the stable, efficient solutions also the ones we find everywhere? Why do they happen to support life? Why do they appear in both cells and stars? There's no need to assume anything mystical to notice the patterns, but it's worth asking why the rules of the universe produce outcomes that feel both functional and aesthetically consistent. Why shapes that help plants grow also show up in our sense of art and beauty. Why the most effective structures are also the ones that recur most frequently. This doesn't suggest a blueprint in the strict sense, no written plan, no design document, but it might suggest a framework, a set of principles that guide what's possible, what's likely, and what's sustainable. Whether that framework comes from physics or mathematics or something more abstract, it's clearly embedded in how matter organizes itself, and it's part of what makes the living world feel so interconnected. Looking at the outer forms of life, it's easy to be impressed by how well everything seems to fit together. But when you go inside, into the cell, the nucleus, the molecules that run everything, that sense of fit doesn't go away. If anything, it becomes sharper. The internal systems of biology are precise, layered, and full of interlocking parts. They don't just function, they coordinate. And the deeper you go, the more it starts to feel like something more than just chemistry. At the core of all this is DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, the molecule that stores genetic information. Every known living thing uses DNA, or its close cousin RNA, to carry the instructions for how to build and maintain itself. DNA isn't just a substance, it's a code. It's built from 4 types of molecules: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, arranged in sequences that determine how proteins are made. Those proteins, in turn, run the machinery of life. It's often compared to a language, not just because it uses a limited alphabet, but because it has structure, syntax, meaning. A small change in a DNA sequence can alter a protein's shape and function, sometimes slightly, sometimes drastically. The same gene might be reused in different organisms, performing similar roles with small variations. And the way that information is read, copied, and interpreted is so organized that it feels less like a chemical reaction and more like a process. When you look at how DNA works, it's not just about storing information, it's about managing it. There are sequences that act like start and stop signs, signaling when a gene should be activated. There are regulatory genes that control other genes. There are repair systems that scan for errors during copying and correct them. And all of this happens inside a structure just a few micrometers across, in every cell, in every living thing. That level of organization raises questions, not because it's hard to imagine how it came to be, but because it's hard to ignore how effective it is. The standard explanation is evolution by natural selection. Small changes in genetic material create variation. The variations that improve survival get passed on. Over time, that leads to complexity. And the evidence for that process is strong. We can see it in fossils, in laboratory experiments, in the shared genetics of related species. But even within that framework, the mechanisms themselves stand out. Proteins fold into specific 3-dimensional shapes based on the interactions of their amino acids. That folding is essential to their function. If a protein folds incorrectly, it often can't do its job. And yet, inside living cells, that folding happens automatically, guided by the sequence of the amino acids and assisted by other molecules that act like chaperones. There's no conscious awareness in any of this, but the system works with a kind of elegance that's hard to dismiss. It's not random trial and error. It's thousands of moving parts working together in the right order at the right time. Consider enzymes, proteins that speed up chemical reactions. Without them, most of the reactions that keep organisms alive would happen too slowly to matter. But with them, those reactions happen millions of times faster. Enzymes are highly specific. Each one fits its target like a key in a lock. They're not just functional, they're selective. And life depends on that selectivity to control when and how things happen. Then there are molecular motors, tiny machines made of protein that move things around inside cells. Some of them walk along cellular structures, carrying cargo from one place to another. Others spin, pump, or open and close gates. They convert chemical energy into motion, often in ways that mirror mechanical devices at a much larger scale. None of these systems are unique to complex life. Bacteria have them. Plants have them. Every living thing is built from variations of the same tools. The parts are different, but the principles are shared. That consistency suggests a common origin, which supports the idea of evolution. But it also raises the question of where the original instructions came from. The first sequences, the first proteins, the first membranes. Abiogenesis, the origin of life from non-living matter, is an area of active research. Scientists have proposed various models for how the first self-replicating molecules might have formed under early Earth conditions. Some theories involve clay surfaces, deep-sea vents, or ice-covered lakes. There's progress, but no single explanation has been universally accepted. The challenge is that life requires more than just molecules. It requires systems that copy, regulate, respond, and evolve. And while it's possible that those systems emerge gradually from simpler forms, the transition between chemistry and biology remains one of the most difficult steps to model. That gap, the space between random molecules and functioning cells, is where some people start to wonder whether biology shows signs of engineering. Not necessarily in the way machines are designed by humans, but in the sense that the pieces seem unusually well suited to the roles they play. The code isn't just data, it's executable. It runs instructions, it modifies itself, it adapts in real time. Even the way genetic information is compacted into the nucleus shows this efficiency. Human DNA, if stretched out, would be about 2 meters long, yet it fits inside a microscopic space, wrapped around proteins, folded into loops, and organized so that the right genes can be accessed when needed. That's not chaos, that's management. And beyond DNA, cells contain multiple layers of feedback systems, signals that trigger growth, division, repair, or death. These systems keep organisms in balance. They respond to damage, stress, hunger, infection. They communicate with each other through chemical messages, adjusting based on conditions. It's not that mistakes don't happen, they do, but the system doesn't depend on perfection. It depends on resilience. Biology isn't flawless. Mutations can cause disease. Systems break down. But the fact that life continues despite constant disruption is itself a kind of engineering. Not rigid, but adaptive. Not static, but dynamic. This doesn't mean cells were designed by a conscious mind. It may be that the systems we see are the ones that survived because they work. And that's entirely plausible. But when you see the level of coordination involved, the natural comparison is not just to a factory or a city or a machine, but to a code base, a set of instructions that not only builds itself, but maintains and updates itself. And just like software, biology has layers. There's the raw code, the sequence of DNA. There's the operating system, the cellular machinery that interprets it. There are inputs and outputs, error correction, feedback loops, and there are networks, interactions between genes, proteins, cells, and organs that create behaviors, responses, even thoughts. So the question shifts. Maybe it's not, was biology engineered, but can engineering and biology be thought of in the same terms? Is the comparison just metaphorical? Or does the structure of life suggest a deeper connection between systems that emerge through evolution and systems that are built intentionally? That's still open. But the deeper we look into life's code, the more structured it seems. Not random, not improvised, but layered, regulated, and deeply integrated. Once you understand that DNA acts like a code, it becomes harder not to see it as a kind of language. It doesn't use words or grammar in the way spoken languages do, but it has its own rules, its own alphabet, syntax, structure, and meaning. It's written in a 4-letter chemical script, and it contains instructions not just for building proteins, but for when and where and how those proteins should be made. It's information stored physically, instructions embedded in matter. The question is whether that language was invented, discovered, or something in between. DNA isn't just a long chain of chemicals. It's organized into genes, which are sequences that can be transcribed and translated into proteins. But those genes are only part of the story. There are also regulatory regions, sequences that tell the cell when to start and stop reading a gene, how much of a protein to make, or what conditions should trigger a change. There are enhancers and silencers, sequences that influence genes from a distance. There are introns, which are parts of a gene that get cut out before the final product is made. And there are non-coding regions, sometimes called junk DNA, though that term is slowly disappearing, that may play roles in structuring the genome or influencing how it's expressed. All of this behaves less like raw code and more like a programming language, one that includes not just instructions but context, one that supports layering and conditional behavior. In computers, code gets compiled and executed. In cells, DNA is transcribed and translated. Both processes require a system that knows how to interpret a set of symbols. Both rely on precision, structure, and timing, and both can break down when the rules aren't followed. But DNA doesn't sit there being read all at once. Only a small fraction of it is active at any given time. Different genes are turned on in different cell types, at different stages of development, in response to different signals. The same DNA sequence can lead to very different outcomes, depending on what part of the body it's in, or what environmental conditions are present. That flexibility is part of what makes complex life possible, and it's part of what makes DNA feel like more than just data. It behaves like a system. What's interesting is that this system appears to be universal. All known life on Earth uses the same basic genetic code, the same 4 letters, the same codon structure, the same translation rules. A codon is a set of 3 bases that codes for 1 amino acid. There are 64 possible codons and only 20 standard amino acids, so the system has redundancy. Some codons are synonyms, others act as punctuation. Start here, stop here. But that whole system is shared by bacteria, plants, animals, everything. That suggests a common origin. Some point in the deep past when life settled on one code and every branch of evolution carried it forward. But it also raises a question. Why that code? Why that structure? Scientists have explored whether the genetic code is optimized, whether it's the best possible arrangement of codons to minimize errors and support flexibility. Some studies suggest it's close to optimal, not perfect, but surprisingly efficient at reducing the effects of mutations and ensuring robustness. If that's true, then it could be that life didn't just adopt any code. It adopted one that works particularly well. Whether that means the code was selected naturally, or that certain structures were more likely to survive, depends on how you look at it. Either way, what we have now is a system that works across all forms of life and has continued to work, with variations, for billions of years. There's also the question of interpretation. Humans didn't invent DNA, but we did discover how to read it, how to translate chemical sequences into information. And when we did, we found something astonishing. Not just complexity, but logic. Not just molecules, but instructions. That discovery has led to entire fields of research: genetics, molecular biology, bioinformatics. We now manipulate DNA with tools like CRISPR, redesigning genes with increasing precision. We can synthesize sequences, insert them into cells, and watch them function. In some ways, we've started writing in the language of life, but we didn't create the language itself. It was already there. This is where the idea of design often re-enters the conversation. Not because DNA looks manufactured in the way a computer chip does, but because it behaves with purpose. It handles information in ways that resemble software, logic circuits, or carefully planned instructions. It's not random noise, it's structure with output, and it's embedded in every living thing. There's also the issue of meaning. In human languages, meaning comes from intention. Someone writes or speaks with a goal of conveying something. With DNA, the meaning isn't conscious, it's functional. A sequence has meaning because it causes something to happen. It builds a protein, triggers a reaction, allows a process to unfold. But does that kind of meaning carry the same weight? Is functional meaning enough to call it a language? Or is that just a metaphor we're borrowing from human systems? That's part of what makes this area so ambiguous. The metaphors work because the systems are similar, but the interpretation depends on what you're looking for. You can see DNA as the result of evolutionary trial and error, where sequences that work are kept and refined. Or you can see it as a system so tightly tuned that it suggests forethought, not necessarily a conscious designer, but maybe a deeper structure behind the way life organizes itself. There are even efforts to design entirely new genetic codes, alternative base pairs, synthetic amino acids, new rules of translation. So far, these experiments show that other systems could work in theory, but that only highlights how remarkable the natural one is. It's efficient, it's resilient, and it supports an enormous range of biological outcomes, all built on the same basic script. Whether DNA was discovered or designed may come down to what you mean by those words. It wasn't designed by people, and it wasn't discovered in the way math or physics might be. There's something eternal and abstract. It's a structure that seems to emerge naturally from the rules of chemistry and the dynamics of evolution. But the fact that it works so well and in such consistent ways makes it feel like it has properties we usually associate with engineered systems. That doesn't prove anything. But it does shift the conversation from wondering how life began to noticing that life behaves as if it's built on a kind of deep grammar. One we didn't invent, one we're still learning how to read. Living things can't survive without a protective barrier, not just physically but chemically, a membrane that separates inside from outside. At the scale of cells, that's the cell wall. At the scale of the planet, it's the atmosphere. But unlike the walls of a container, Earth's atmosphere isn't static. It changes, moves, responds, and regulates. It's not alive in itself, but it acts as part of the living system. It holds everything in, but it also lets just enough out. The atmosphere is made up mostly of nitrogen, about 78%, followed by oxygen, argon, carbon dioxide, and trace gases. That mix may seem ordinary, but it's anything but. Change the ratio slightly and the system stops working. Too much oxygen and wildfires become uncontrollable. Too little and animals suffocate. Without nitrogen, plants can't grow. Without carbon dioxide, photosynthesis stops. The percentages aren't symbolic, they're functional. They maintain the chemistry that life depends on. Balance didn't appear all at once. Early Earth had a different atmosphere, full of volcanic gases like methane, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds. It was toxic by modern standards, but not sterile. Microorganisms evolved in it, and eventually some of them began to release oxygen through photosynthesis. That oxygen reacted with iron in the oceans, forming rust that sank to the seafloor. For a long time, oxygen levels stayed low. Then they began to climb, slowly, then rapidly. That change, called the Great Oxygenation Event, transformed the atmosphere. Oxygen allowed for more efficient energy production inside cells. That made multicellular life possible. But it also caused extinctions. Organisms adapted to the old atmosphere couldn't survive in the new one. So the system reset. Life evolved again under the new rules, with new strategies. Oxygen didn't just enable complexity, it enforced it. Even now, the oxygen level is regulated, not by a machine, but by feedback between ecosystems, geology, and climate. Plants and algae produce it. Animals consume it. Fires reduce it. Weathering of rocks locks away carbon. Volcanoes release it. If one part moves too far in one direction, the others adjust. The result is not perfect stability, but bounded variation. It's a system that breathes, in cycles, in pulses, in feedback. One of the most noticeable aspects of the atmosphere is its pressure. At sea level, it presses down with a force of about 14.7 pounds per square inch. That pressure keeps water in liquid form, allows for efficient gas exchange in lungs, and supports everything from the boiling point of liquids to the structural strength of biological tissues. If it were much lower, water would evaporate too easily. If it were higher, respiration might not work the same way. The pressure supports the conditions for life, and life, in turn, maintains the gases that set the pressure. The composition of the atmosphere also determines how heat moves around the planet. Some gases absorb and re-radiate infrared energy. These are the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and others. Without them, Earth would be cold and lifeless. But too many, and the planet overheats. The system is dynamic. Greenhouse gases come and go, but the range stays mostly within the limits where life can adapt. Then there's the ozone layer, a thin region of the atmosphere that absorbs most of the sun's ultraviolet radiation. UV light is dangerous to DNA. Without that protection, mutations increase, cells die, life becomes unsustainable. But with just enough ozone, harmful rays are blocked while beneficial light passes through. The ozone layer forms naturally from reactions involving oxygen and sunlight, but it can also be damaged by man-made chemicals. That vulnerability isn't a flaw. It's a sign that the system is sensitive, tuned to specific interactions, reliant on a steady input of energy and chemistry. The atmosphere also moves. Winds distribute heat, moisture, and particles across the globe. Jet streams steer weather patterns. Ocean currents interact with air currents. Together they move energy from the equator to the poles, balancing temperature and shaping climate zones. Without this movement, the tropics would overheat, and the poles would freeze completely. With it, the planet remains livable across a wide range of latitudes. Then there's the hydrologic cycle, powered by evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. Water vapor rises, forms clouds, then falls as rain or snow. That rain feeds rivers, recharges aquifers, grows forests. The atmosphere is the vehicle for that motion. It connects land, sea, and sky, not in a poetic sense, but in a chemical one. And it does so without needing central control. It works because of temperature, pressure, altitude, sunlight, physics, not planning. But the result looks like coordination. Atmospheric circulation also carries tiny particles, dust, pollen, microbes. Some of those particles affect cloud formation. Some carry nutrients across oceans. Some seed ecosystems in entirely new places.